This is ILF Radio, our weekly podcast, where we peek into the soul of Indian heritage with our esteemed guests and listen through the old season walls. This week, we're traveling the roads of what is popularly known to us as Lutyens Delhi. We are looking into how the capital shift led us to this architectural boon, the town planning committee involved in it, and was it really Lutyens Delhi? But mostly how these edifices have made a truly dynamic capital out of Delhi and the legacy that it has left behind. So pack your bags and get ready for this ride.
Hi, I'm Priya from India Lost and Found. For this episode, we have Miss Swapna Liddle with us. Swapna Liddle is an author and a historian with a PhD in the history of Delhi, a city she fell in love with after arriving here as a college student. This love has led her to be closely involved in the efforts to preserve its rich heritage, monuments, and sites. She has been associated for many years with the Indian National Trust for Art and Cultural Heritage and was until recently the convener of the Delhi chapter. She has been sharing her passion for Delhi's history and heritage with the general public through heritage walks, informative lectures, newspaper articles, and radio show conversations. Miss Liddle is the author of Connaught Place and the Making of New Delhi, Chandni Chowk, the Mughal city of Old Delhi, and Delhi, 14 historic walks. With her immense and in-depth knowledge about Delhi and its evolution through the centuries, particularly in its role as the capital of several large empires over time, the last of which was the British Raj, she is an obvious expert to talk with us about New Delhi, the area we popularly known as Lutyens Delhi. The background of the thought process of British architects and planners who cleverly married the Western architectural vocabulary with that of Eastern, comprising ancient Indian as well as Mughal sensibilities, is well worth exploring. The complex at New Delhi includes what we know as the Rashtrapati Bhavan, Secretariat buildings comprising north and south blocks, Parliament House, and Central Vista or Rajpath leading up to India Gate, and was built during the 1910s and 20s and unveiled in 1931. In order to create, as one London newspaper called it, the New Delhi, a city to rival Paris and Washington, Edward Lutyens and Herbert Baker were selected to design the Capitol complex under the then Viceroy Charles Hardinge. The capital of the empire was shifting from Calcutta to Delhi, and it needed to make a statement. It needed grandeur. And so began the vast undertaking of blending the souls together. All the buildings in the area brilliantly incorporate both elements, the Indian decorative ones and the Western columns, round arched openings, and classical symmetry in a style that was unique in its time and place. Swapna, when you first saw the area as a young girl, what stood out for you and why?
I first saw this area when I was a college student. That's when I'd come to Delhi and first had my experience of what New Delhi and particularly this Raisina Hill was. And first of all, it was spectacular. It was the buildings when you stand at the base and look up at them. They make an impression on you. They're so beautiful and so imposing. The other aspect of that was that in those days there were very much fewer of these security barriers that you see. In fact, when we used to go, I used to go from the south, which is the area called Moti Bagh, and where I used to live, and I used to go towards the north to, say, the Cathedral Church of the Redemption. We used to actually drive through Rashtrapati Bhavan campus to get there. So that was, it was a level of intimate interaction which was quite different from what it is today. And finally, it was really as a public space that I also experienced it, because the boat club lawns around near India Gate were a place that we used to have all sorts of protests, demonstrations, as well as, of course, recreation. But I remember we once did some sort of, as college students, did some sort of a protest over there. So it was these different personas of the space, different levels of interaction that I had.
Fantastic. And but this shift, when the imperial power decided to shift its capital from Calcutta to Delhi, what was it thinking? What do we know about that?
That is a very interesting question. A lot of people know a very basic answer, which is that the British were getting fed up of Calcutta, and particularly because of the rising national movement, and they wanted to come away to Delhi. Now, that is the simple explanation. But actually, the answer is quite complex. Why? What? No doubt the national movement was growing, and the British response initially had been to try and suppress it through measures such as the partition of Bengal. And that kind of repressive measure actually led to the national movement becoming even stronger. So in time, they decided that a different approach was needed, a more conciliatory approach to try and address some of the demands that the Indians had. And as part of that, one of those was giving Indians greater representation within the councils, for instance, with a little bit of more participation for Indian members in the governmental process. With that came the idea that one of the ways that this could become more meaningful is if the various provinces were given more powers. And particularly since Bengal had seen so much unrest, they wanted to give Bengal of the status of a full province and some amount of autonomy as a province. And the corollary to that was that you move the central government away from Bengal. So to give Bengal a slightly greater powers. So to shift it away. Now, once it was to be shifted, where? And there the symbolic power of Delhi came in. Delhi for many centuries had been the capital of various empires, and the British realized this, and they knew that if they had to make over the British Raj, to give it a new face, and to try and convince Indians that we are trying to do these things for your benefit, then it would make sense for them to locate their capital in a place which was already seen as having a history of Indian empires, whether it's the Sultanate or the Mughals. There was this long association of Indian power with British. So they were leaving Calcutta, which seemed like a British town, symbol of that alien colonial rule, and coming to Delhi. So that was the idea of this shift.
Wow, one doesn't really know what goes behind the scenes in making decisions, right? That brings to mind another choice that they made. In Delhi, what made them choose Raisina Hill as the site? Were there any other sites that were considered as well?
Oh, yes. Raisina is definitely not their first choice, in fact. When the announcement that the capital would be shifting, incidentally, was made in December 1911. And the occasion was the coronation darbar of George V, who was the new British monarch, right, who actually came all the way to Delhi to announce his assumption of the title of Emperor of India. So that was one of the titles of the British monarch. And he had this grand coronation darbar in Delhi. And it was during this that the announcement had been made. And at that time, actually foundation stones had been laid at the darbar site. Now, this darbar site was to the north of today what we call Old Delhi, Shahjahanabad, right, the Mughal city. And this coronation stones had been laid there, assuming that a new city would also be built when this capital was shifted. Now, it was not, in fact, George V himself made clear to people later that it doesn't mean that you have to build the city there. You should go about in a scientific manner, discovering what is the sites which are the sites that should be considered. So what they did was that I will talk about a town planning committee that was set up a little later, but this town planning committee was was constituted, and they went and surveyed very different sites. And one site, of course, which was considered was that Coronation Park site, and they rejected it. They rejected it mainly because it was a very low-lying area, and those who are familiar with Delhi will realize that that area, it's called Coronation Park these days, that Darbar site, is very prone to flooding. So it would definitely not have been a good choice. So that was rejected. Another site that was considered was Shahadara. Now, Shahadara is across the river from, roughly from Old Delhi, from Shahjahanabad. And they said that this would be an interesting site. Also, it had lots of land and it was vacant and they could use it. They rejected that also, mainly because they felt that a lot of the Indian population would actually continue to live in the old city. And if that was going to happen, then the connectivity between the two would be a little limited. I mean, we realize this even today that, crossing the Yamuna is a problem. There are a limited number of bridges, so that those can be bottlenecks. So that was rejected. They also considered Narayana. Narayana, we all know, is to the west of Delhi, west of the ridge. And it was a very good site. It had good drainage, it had lots of ample space, and still they rejected it for a very interesting reason. They said that the ridge cuts off the view of the older monuments of Delhi. It has no connection with those monuments, and therefore it cannot be considered to be Delhi. They were recognizing a very important factor here, that the historic development of Delhi, all the older cities were located between the river and the ridge. So this being on the west side of the ridge, outside this triangle, was not historic Delhi. So they rejected it for that reason. Again, the historic idea that it had to be Delhi specifically for its symbolic importance. And therefore the choice that was left then was Raisina.
Wow, understanding all of these things help you understand so much about the present, doesn't it? And one of the questions that I have in my mind is, we often refer to the site in context as Lutyens Delhi. But can you shed light on the actual role that Lutyens had in the whole process?
that is an interesting question. Lutyens and Lutyens' name, and he's a controversial figure. So there is often this question that what role this Lutyens' Delhi, and I'd say no, it is not Lutyens' Delhi, because first of all, I had mentioned the town planning committee, which picked the site, made a choice of the site, also did some of the initial town plan. What exactly, because a city is not just architecture, it is the roads, the layout, how everything will work together, which is often more important than the architecture. So the town planning committee actually consisted of 3 people. One of them was George Swinton, who was a municipal administrator, and then John Brodie, who was a municipal engineer. And then thirdly, the architect, who was Edwin Lutyens. So it was this 3-member committee which actually drew up the plans. And even this committee, its initial plans were rejected by the Viceroy, who was Harding. And why were they rejected? They had imagine if they had been fulfilled, we would have had a very different kind of Delhi. First of all, it had a grid plan. It did not have the kind of roundabouts and radiating roads that we are familiar with. They had made a grid plan initially. The second thing was that the main avenue, which we see today, Rajpath, which goes from Rashtrapati Bhavan to Purana Killa, had been aligned between what would be Rashtrapati Bhavan, Viceroy's house, to Jama Masjid. Now that was the alignment they had thought of earlier. So for various reasons, Harding had another look at it, and there was another architect who was called Henry Vaughan Lanchester, and they sat together and considered this and came up with an alternative, which was that the alignment would be of the main avenue would be to Purana Killa, and that instead of a grid plan, you would have this radiating roads from roundabouts. Incidentally, the old town planning committee had also considered locating the Viceroy's house behind Raisina Hill, at the foothills of the ridge, in the area which we call Malcha. So That was also rejected. In fact, the location of Government House right on top of Raisina Hill was a suggestion that was finally so the suggestion of Harding. So it's these people, Lanchester, Harding, the town planning committee as a whole, rather than Lutyens himself, which are very largely responsible for the town plan. The architecture, however, particularly of some iconic buildings like Rashtrapati Bhavan, which was originally called Viceroy's House, and India Gate, these are definitely the work of Edwin Lutyens, and for that he should get full credit.
Wow. And talking about that, let's look at the architecture of New Delhi. Can you tell us about the unique style, the elements that were incorporated, and the influence behind all of that?
Yes, when this city was built, of course, the city has a lot of elements apart from the main architecture of the important public buildings. But in the plan of New Delhi, this did have a significant role to play. This, what we call the central vista, which stretches from Rashtrapati Bhavan right to India Gate. And the main buildings here, which was the Viceroy's House, which we call Rashtrapati Bhavan today, the Secretariat buildings, India Gate, etc., they had a team of two architects design those. And those two architects were Edwin Lutyens and Herbert Baker. And here, I think, if you look at the architecture, again, the role of the politics of the whole thing and Harding's influence becomes very, very important, because both Lutyens and Baker were trained in the European classical, neoclassical tradition, and the imperial sort of idiom they wanted to incorporate. They wanted to make, Lutyens particularly expressed this again and again, that he wanted a proper the British Empire to leave its stamp on this. And Harding kept reminding them of the importance of the politics of it, the fact that this was meant to be an Indian capital of a British Raj, which was an Indian Raj. So therefore, he kept saying, bring the Indian element into it. And therefore, look at what they did. First of all, look at the use of the materials, the red and beige sandstone. Those are the materials of which a lot of Indian imperial architecture of the earlier period is made. A lot of Mughal buildings, a lot of Sultanate buildings incorporate that red sandstone particularly. So that is there. Secondly, look at for instance, the dome of the Rashtrapati Bhavan. It's modeled on the Sanchi Stupa. The Sanchi Stupa railings are also used in Vijay Chowk and other places. Lots of little chhatris, those little cupolas that you see, the chhatris are used. Rashtrapati Bhavan has a really impressive chhajja, that overhang, which is a very, very Indian element. They incorporated jalis. They incorporated a little bit of quiche also in the form of little elephant heads which are on the domes, etc. But you can see a very conscious effort to bring in Indian elements of Indian forms and motifs into the architecture. And that is a defining feature. And it makes a very, very unique statement, which is very different from anything that had come before or after.
Indeed. I really feel so too. But tell us a little about what happened when the shift was made. All these structures put in place, the city inaugurated. What then? What was life like after that?
First of all, let's realize that it took a long time. And the reason that it took a long time was because the First World War intervened, and that led to a lot of delays for various reasons. So it took a long time. It took almost 20 years to implement this project, from the time the shift in capital was announced in December 1911 to the inauguration, which was in February 31. So 20 years. Of course, in the meanwhile, the capital had already shifted in 1912, December 1912, the capital shifted to Delhi, but it was housed temporarily in the civil lines area. A temporary capital was established there. As the buildings of New Delhi slowly came up, they started getting used. So the secretariats were being used by the end of 1926. Viceroy's house got its first occupant in December 1929. So the Viceroy had already moved there. Finally, the inauguration is usually dated from 10th February 1931, on the day in which the columns of dominion, there are these four pillars which stand in front of North Block and South Block, these were formally inaugurated, and that is the usual dates that we take as the inauguration of New Delhi. Life in this new city was a bit dull, I must say. Delhi was quite sparsely populated. I have talked about Central Vista, but I have not talked about the rest of the city. And the rest of the city, it was made on a garden city plan. And if you look at the garden city, it has large plots of land, lot of greenery, low density of construction. So the bungalows, of course, are small relative to the size of the plot. Even the other developments, which are colonies which are made for the clerical staff, etc., they also are generally low rise. And this was sparsely populated. It did not have the hustle and bustle of a more compact city like Shahjahanabad was. Connaught Place was built slowly. What happened was that Connaught Place, though it was built on a unified design, it was the individual blocks were developed by individual investors. So that was a piecemeal affair. And the shopkeepers moved in, started running businesses, but it was all quite staid. And of course, Connaught Place was very elitist, though markets like Gold Market were not so elitist and catered more to the Indian population. Other thing that used to happen was that every year the government used to shift to Simla in the summer. That meant that the city became a little dead during the summer. The higher officials used to move, or some of the clerical staff used to move, and therefore the city was kind of empty. And a lot of the shops also used to actually shut up their Delhi branches and open their Simla branches at that time. An interesting thing is that the water channels that you see on both sides of Rajpath, the water channels and the fountains used to be shut down in the summer because they said there was nobody to enjoy them. So therefore, it was not a very lively city at that point of time.
Wow, this itself would be an interesting study at some other point in time. Very interesting. And let me ask you another question. We know that World War I had slowed down the pace of construction a lot. But did the World War II also have any impact on New Delhi and its life?
Yes, it did. I've been just talking about how the fact that it was a very quiet and somewhat dead city, particularly in the summer. There were two or three impacts of World War II. One kind of impact was on the social life. First of all, because of the war, what happened was that Delhi became the hub of the war which was being held in the Asia Pacific. So there was an influx of soldiers and officials, a lot of military presence in Delhi, that led to a greater liveliness in the market, for instance. A lot of American soldiers, and American soldiers were well paid. They had the money to spend on restaurants, on all sorts of other entertainments, movies, etc. in Connaught Place. So business really started looking up, and Connaught Place became much more lively. More businesses opened up in response. So that was one aspect. The other aspect was that because of the needs of the war, the government decided not to shift to Simla in the summer. So it became an all-round capital, all-year capital. And that all-year capital then obviously was more, that whole business of becoming dead in the summer was then avoided. So that was the impact on the social life. All this new military activity, administrative activity also needed places to house them. So a whole lot of temporary construction came up. So all a lot of it was on either side of Rajpath, which was what we call the Central Vista. Some of it, we sometimes don't realize. Those people who are of my generation will remember the old cottage industries emporium that used to be on Janpath. And this was there till about definitely 15 years ago or so, I'd say. And that building was actually an old World War II structure, which had been reused later. So a lot of these old structures date from that time. So there was a huge amount of boost in construction activity happening in New Delhi, though it was of a temporary sort.
Oh, and then another thing that influenced or must have influenced was post-independence time, when there was a population explosion in Delhi, and also the government was different from the colonial one. What impact did this have on New Delhi in particular?
Uh, yes, I mean, I was talking about the influx of the new kinds of people during the World War, and partition and independence was something else altogether. One was that there was the population of Delhi did increase a lot because of how the number of people who were coming in from, particularly from West Pakistan with partition. There was a huge shift in population, and Delhi's population grew suddenly and very explosively. Uh, that, of course, one of the things it did was that it led to, in the long term, the development of other colonies around Delhi and the increase in the size of Delhi altogether. But in this area that we're talking about, the New Delhi area, there was also a change. One was that a lot of this population needed small, they were business people, they needed to earn their livings, they needed retail spaces, for instance. So Connaught Place became even more lively. Some of them, very temporary structures that came up. There were a more formal expansion was all the shops down Janpath, which were made at that time. So the commercial activity really picked up around Connaught Place and that area. So that was a very important impact. Another one was that there was new office construction that was happening. The state, which was a new state, the post-independence Indian government was one that had a much greater role than the colonial government. The colonial government was only interested in recovering revenue from people, from making some public works which would further the British Empire, like roads and railways, which would fetch the raw materials. And they were interested in collecting and policing the people. So these very, very limited functions of the colonial state were very different from the post-independence Indian state. Because the independent India, the state took on the responsibilities of industrialization, made greater welfare measures, etc. So there was an increase in functions, and therefore new ministries coming up, new office space required. So that's when you have this spate of construction. You have Udyog Bhavan, Krishi Bhavan, Shastri Bhavan, Nirman Bhavan, all these things coming up gradually to fill those official spaces that were also required, that need that was required. So there's of course, a lot of these functions were also in the, they made use of the older wartime construction. So there was, for instance, there was something called the Theatre Communications Building, which was a sort of it was a communications building during the wartime use, and that was used to house the state's emporia, the emporia which we today see on Khadak Singh Marg. So that kind of reuse also happened. But these were the kind of ways in which post-independence, why the reasons for change post-independence.
So, such busy times and such evolution. Now, when we look at the India Gate, the area has evolved from being a war memorial to depicting the ethos of an independent India, and also representing a recreational zone for several generations. Can you tell us how this place has evolved and what does it mean to the people of Delhi?
Rajpath, of course, means the Republic Day parade. And it was meant as a ceremonial avenue. That is something that has remained pretty unchanged down the centuries, I think. Oh, sorry, not the centuries, I mean the years, the decades, particularly since independence. The other thing that was there was a sort of cultural hub at the intersection of Rajpath and Janpath. These roads were called Kingsway and Queensway in British times. And it was during pre-independence, what had been planned by Lutyens and his associates was that there would be 4 museums at the 4 corners at this intersection. Only 4 museums are, those kind of cultural institutions. So only one was built at that time, which is the National Archives, and the other 3 plots were at that time left empty. Slowly, 2 of those got filled up, one with the National Museum and one with the Indira Gandhi National Center for Arts. So that cultural hub status still remained. Later, of course, another building came up, which was not in that pattern, but the general, that thing of the cultural hub did develop and remained till it's still there, though of course COVID has intervened with our cultural activities. And then lastly, India Gate, which was a war memorial, but it was also a place for people to gather for recreation, just to hang out. And of course, in these days, take selfies. The war memorial has further become a new modern structure has been added to it. But it was intended as a war memorial come a recreational space. And that's how it evolved over a long period of time.
And that's how most of us remember it as well. It's a thought that crosses many people's minds that central Delhi is very low rise, very open. People think that a lot of land is wasted here. Can you comment on that?
This comes up again and again. Why are so few people living in so much land? And I think today we have to shift that argument and say that look at the amount of greenery that we have in the center of Delhi, the large old trees that we have. These are a very valuable lung for the city. If we cut these down, we cannot replace them because new trees take a long time to grow. And if you cut them down and turn this again into a concrete jungle, the city as a whole will suffer also, because we need these green lungs. The ridge is a major green lung, but New Delhi also is a green lung. So I think that is a very, very important factor which we shouldn't forget. And that's one important reason to preserve this.
Wow, yeah. What is the legacy of the town plan of New Delhi? And has it served as an inspiration for the development of other parts of Delhi?
It is. I mean, we don't automatically realize this. For a long time, if you look at the developments of the new colonies that came up after independence, many of them were modeled on this garden city plan, in the sense that Delhi has had very few high rises, even though in our neighborhood there are many more of those. Gurgaon, Noida, you see the kind of development that has happened over there. New Delhi persisted with the low rise, plot of land, house on it, lots of trees on the roads, trees in the compounds of houses also. That was the model that really developed. So I think that low rise, greenery filled model was a legacy of New Delhi, which persisted for a long time, though we have started changing that now.
There is so much to know about this, and one can go on. But there's one final question I have for you. Out of so many structures and features that we've talked about, which one has been your special favorite all these years?
Well, I've talked about a lot of things, and many of them. I love the greenery, I love the architecture. But if I was to pick one element, I would say the Rashtrapati Bhavan. Lutyens, in many ways, as I said, that he is given too much importance in this. He was not even a very nice man. He was quite racist in some ways, but he was a brilliant architect. And I think we will need a completely separate podcast to really go into the intricacies of Rashtrapati Bhavan. But as an architectural thing, it really is a wonder, and it's a work of genius, and I love its overall impact, its little details, which over the years I've come to know a little bit more closely. I absolutely love it.
We would love to hear from you more about the Rashtrapati Bhavan and get to know about it from your point of view. That would be fantastic. But for now, I have to say bye, ma'am, and thank you so much for coming here and speaking with us.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
That's all from us today. Thank you for joining us.